Hey everybody, this is writing micro lesson number 5 on paragraph structure. This is for Honors 112 in the Civilization sequence of the Honors College at the University of Maine, and I'm the instructor, Rob Glover. So today we're going to talk about paragraph structure. We'll jump right to the kind of key points that I want to focus on for this week right at the outset here, which is why is paragraph structure so important? You know, some people sometimes kind of wonder, what difference does it make if I make a paragraph break here or in some other place? Why does this matter so much in relation to my writing? All the words are there. Why does it matter where these breaks are? Isn't this kind of arbitrary? And it's really not. Paragraph structure is actually really important. And sometimes I can look at a student's writing and just from how the paragraphs are constructed, how long they are, how short they are, I can usually kind of tell if there's going to be issues with the student's writing. So why is paragraph structure so important? I'd say 3 reasons. One is manageability. So you know what you're going to say, and you know what your argument is. Your reader doesn't, right? And so your reader is trying to make sense of what you're saying, and they're trying to sustain their interest too. They're trying to kind of zero in and focus on your writing, tune out other things. And paragraph breaks make that manageable. They break the text up into digestible units. It's kind of like, why we cut our food up before we eat it, because it makes it something that we can manage, right? And we can actually get into our mouth and enjoy, as opposed to something less fun. So manageability is important. How you set up your paragraphs is also going to relate to the organization of your paper. You're making choices about how you're structuring your ideas and how you set up your paragraphs. That's really one of the most important choices about how you organize your ideas. What are you going to talk about? How are you going to do so? In what order? Lastly, paragraphs help to transition between one idea, one point, one assertion to another. And so how you construct your paragraphs is going to play a pretty important role in how you transition from one idea to another. So these 3 points, manageability, organization, and transition, that's what I'm really looking for when I'm analyzing a student's paragraph structure and how they're doing with the construction of their paragraphs. All right, so some common writing challenges, and these are writing challenges that I see in student writing. These are writing challenges that I see in my own writing sometimes, the writing of my colleagues. These are things that we continue to work on for the entirety of our careers. We're always writing, right? Regardless of what career, what profession you go into, you're going to be writing. And these are some of the challenges that we often encounter, many of which may be linked to paragraph usage. So perhaps you've gotten a paper back and there's comments in the margin that says you haven't developed this point fully enough. Or sometimes it'll just be a command. It'll say elaborate, tell me more, go into greater depth here. Well, if you're not doing that, if you're not developing your points fully enough, that might be linked to how you're constructing your paragraphs. That might actually be linked to your paragraph usage. If the arguments aren't coherent, if somebody reads your work and says, I don't really get it, I don't really understand what you're saying here, or the argument isn't clear to me, or it seems like this is an area in which I was following the narrative and I kind of lost it here and I'm not sure what you're talking about, that might be linked to your paragraph usage. If you're advancing ideas or arguments that are not supported. So if somebody's, looking at your paper, looking at your writing and saying, it seems like you're trying to argue this, but I just don't see support for that. I don't see evidence for that argument presented here. That can be linked to paragraph usage. And something that oftentimes happens primarily for longer papers, but sometimes even for shorter papers, is there's a thesis statement or there's a question that's asked at the outset, and the writer can kind of stray from that. They move to a point in which by the end of the paper they're arguing something completely different. They're talking about a completely different topic than where they started. That can be linked to paragraph usage, because if you're not being intentional in how you construct your paragraphs and how you transition from one idea to another, you can actually kind of end up down a road you didn't intend to take. Writing can take on a life all its own if we're not systematic in how we approach it. So there's a number of issues that come out of paragraph usage, and being intentional, being systematic in how we construct our paragraphs is really, really important for quality writing. So here are some warning signs These are things, as I said, when I look at student papers, sometimes I can tell just not even having read anything, just looking at the pages themselves, issues we might run into, primarily related to length. So if I'm looking at very long paragraphs, that can be a sign of a couple things. One is that you're trying to make too many points in a single paragraph. There's not a single topic sentence. There's not a single main idea. You are trying to make 4, 5, 6, 7 different points within a single paragraph. And sometimes paragraphs for students can stretch on for multiple pages. If you're doing that, that's a problem. It means the organization of your ideas is not as systematic as it ought to be, right? And your reader is going to get lost. They're going to drown in these long paragraphs. It's going to be unclear to them what is important and what you're saying. It can also be a sign that you're not writing concisely enough. Sometimes in student writing, sometimes particularly in my own writing or the writing of my colleagues, I just see a lot of clutter. I see a 4 or 5 line sentence that could be condensed to a single line. And so if you have very long paragraphs, it might just be a sign that you need to kind of hone your narrative, hone your language a little bit, calibrate your language to a point where you're speaking more concisely. Very short paragraphs are usually a sign that you're not developing your points properly. You don't have a point that you're making and then evidence to support it and then some sort of transition to the next idea. And that can read as choppy. If you have lots of paragraphs, one after another, that are just these kind of singular statements that aren't super well supported, there's not a ton of evidence, it just reads as choppy, and it's not the most engaging way to write. The core issue there, beyond just style, is that you're probably not providing sufficient evidence to back up your points, or you're not providing enough analysis of your own. That can almost read as sort of list-like, right? And lists aren't super fun to read. You need something that is a little bit more sophisticated than that, and something in which you're speaking with your own voice. You're integrating ideas, integrating evidence from other sources, but you're also providing your own perspective and your own ideas. So those are some warning signs. You want to just look at your writing, maybe past writing that you've done, and see where would be problem areas, where would be areas in which I would want to break things up into multiple paragraphs, or if I have very short paragraphs, where I would want to elaborate. So here's what every paragraph ought to contain. There ought to be a topic sentence. This introduces the main idea, the main point of the paragraph. Usually it's kind of the first sentence, right? It's the first thing that the reader is going to read in that paragraph, and it gives them a sense of what you're going to argue in this 3, 5, 6 sentences in a paragraph. Beyond that, once you have your main idea, the main point, the main argument, you need to provide supporting evidence or examples. These are going to substantiate or elaborate upon a claim utilizing evidence. And evidence can be lots of different things. It can be data, it can be statistics, it can be textual evidence. We rely a lot upon textual evidence in this class, but there needs to be some sort of evidence or examples that you're using to either elaborate upon or substantiate that claim that you're making. There should ideally be some analysis, right? Your own idea, your own contribution, and that should be linked to the overarching argument of your paper, of your thesis statement. So you want to speak with your own voice within a paragraph. And then there'll be a concluding sentence. And usually the concluding sentence is kind of like a bridge to the next idea, right? You're going to have a subsequent paragraph. It might be a related idea, but you're going to be discussing something that is substantively different. And you kind of lead your reader into that next statement, right? So in a very general sense, that's what you should be thinking about as you construct your paragraphs. It shouldn't simply be, okay, I have 5 sentences, time for a paragraph break, and you start a new paragraph. But paragraphs ought to contain certain information, and once you've done this, then you can move on to another paragraph. So this is one of the questions that students often face if they're struggling with paragraph usage. When do I begin a new paragraph? Well, first and foremost, as I suggested just a minute ago, if you're introducing a new idea or a new point, that's a new paragraph, right? So you might have a very large idea that contains kind of subpoints, right? So maybe your argument is that religion is the core source of identity in early civilizations, right? That's a big point. That's probably not going to, you're probably not going to be able to sum that up in a single paragraph. But you could have that, overarching point, and then you have a series of smaller paragraphs in which you provide evidence from different time periods, different civilizations, different points in history, different texts, right? And those would each be individual paragraphs. But if you're transitioning to a new idea, a new point, you're changing the focus a little bit, that's a good place to begin a new paragraph. You can also begin a new paragraph when you're introducing contrasting information or ideas. So if there's a really heated debate about one question, right? Nature versus nurture, right? You might kind of delve into the different arguments on one side, and then as you begin to introduce the other ideas, you're going to do so in the context of a new paragraph. You also want to be merciful to your readers, right? So you may have an idea that you've elaborated upon, and you look at it and you realize, whoa, I was just kind of writing stream of consciousness, and now I have this thing that goes on for a page and a half. Well, think about how you could structure that page and a half sentiment into multiple paragraphs. What are the different ideas contained there? What are the different points that I'm making within this larger paragraph? If a paragraph is too long, and you've probably had this experience, it can be harder for readers to follow. There's something about the end of a paragraph, the beginning of a new paragraph, that just readers breathe a sigh of relief, and they think about the information that was in the preceding paragraph, and they get ready to engage with the next paragraph. And then lastly, when you end your introduction or you start your conclusion, that's a good place to have a paragraph break, right? So you lay out what you're going to do within the paper, or you're shifting to summation, talking about the significance of what you've argued, and that's typically a place where there would be a paragraph break. You don't want to jump straight from your introduction and your thesis statement and not have a paragraph break and just jump into analysis. And in the same way, you don't want to just put a conclusion right on the tail end of a paragraph in which you're making a subpoint. So those elements of the paper generally are going to be set apart, and you do so through paragraph breaks. So I'm going to give you an example here. This is an example that I just pulled from a writing center online, and I like it because they diagram these different components of a paragraph. And it's actually not related directly to anything that we discuss in our classes. It's probably for a psych class or organizational management, something like that. But it's a good example of just kind of the mechanics of how to construct a paragraph. So you have a topic sentence here, right? It says, by its very nature, motivation requires a degree of individual satisfaction or narcissism. So the reader knows that the overarching thrust of this paragraph is going to be talking about the relationship between motivation and individual satisfaction or narcissism. Then they're going to integrate some evidence, right? So they have some literature, some research articles that they've gone out and found from different authors. They cite them, and they talk, in very generalized terms about what their core findings are. So you have an initial statement from the existing research, a second statement. Then they're going to integrate their own analysis. They say, it can be argued that the desire to improve one's status is a highly motivational force and is central to the idea of narcissistic motivation. The narcissistic motivational strategies put forward by Shaw et al. Are concerned with motivation for life in general, but may also have applications in the context of work. So there's their analysis, their own contribution. They're speaking with their own voice. And then they have this concluding statement. These strategies, with their focus on personal needs, demonstrate that narcissism is an essential component of motivation. And so maybe the next paragraph is going to deal with ways that we can apply what we know about narcissism and motivation into the workplace, into management, into how we approach daily tasks, things like that. So this is a really well-constructed paragraph. Granted, this is probably not the type of paragraph that you would write for an honors class. It seems more specific. Maybe this is something you'd write in your own discipline. It's probably for a more advanced research paper than the types of writing that we do. But the general framework is a good one. That you have the topic sentence, you have evidence, you have analysis in the student's own voice, and then you have a concluding statement that is potentially a good bridge to some other elements of the paper, some other area that they're going to explore in relation to this general topic. So think about ways in which you can be this intentional, this structured in your use of paragraphs. There's a few resources that I'll mention here. Lots of good resources online for paragraph structure, and this is an area in which students struggle. Like even really good writers struggle. Sometimes students who are highly creative and have lots of ideas, the ideas flow forth almost too quickly to shoehorn them into a paragraph structure, which is fine. You can write kind of initially and then go back and tweak it and revise it and kind of map that structure onto it. But just understand that this is an area where it's pretty common to see students struggle. Ideally, you want to be working on this right at the outset of your college career, and you want to be intentional in how you use paragraph structures, because pretty much everything you write is going to be long enough that you're breaking it up into multiple paragraphs. So a couple resources I would recommend. As usual, I think I've directed you to this resource numerous times now, but the Purdue Online Writing Lab, OWL, has a good set of resources on paragraph structure, and also the University of Maryland Writing Center too has some good resources on paragraph structure in relation to a larger essay. So I encourage you to check those out if this is an area in which you struggle. And I think that's it. That's it for this week. The one thing I will just go back to again is that the rubric for this week and how I'm assessing your use of paragraph structure is going to be focused on these three things. Does your writing break the text into digestible units? Is it manageable? Does it help you organize your ideas? And are you being intentional in how you structure those paragraphs? And are you utilizing paragraphs to transition from one idea to another? So keep that in mind as you're working on this week's essay. And that's all for now. I look forward to reading your work. Thanks.